Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
Just 9 days after 9/11, this American, who says his only crime was being Muslim, found himself the target of an FBI probe. And Muslims say they are still under fire in the domestic war on terrorism. Part of a pattern of eroding civil rights post 9/11, or no more than our national security demands. 1 year later, a 9/11 update right here on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
It is a time for regret and remembrance, for the praising of heroes and the mourning of lost lives. But it also seems a fitting time for appraising the policies prompted by the attacks, the effectiveness of the war on terrorism on the home front, and the validity of charges that its cost has been too high. I'm Raymond Brown, and today, the first of a special 2-show 9/11 update on the ongoing struggle between national security and civil liberties. Are we reaching for one at the expense of the other? We'll hear arguments on all sides of that question. Here in the studio, as we bring together 3 eminently qualified experts whose vast experience, theoretical and hands-on, leads them to 3 quite different conclusions. With so much informed opinion here, so much at stake, and so little time in 1/2 hour, we will carry the conversation through this week's program and next week's too. But first, to set the stage for the talk to come, here, as always, Sandy King.
Raymond, the enormity of the tragedy, the horror, the fear, and the ongoing threat have pushed up the public's approval and kept its criticism down. But the anti-terrorist initiatives from the White House and the Department of Justice have, with little fanfare, come under some fire, not only in the civil rights community, but in the press, in the Congress, in the courts. And here in New Jersey, some see a bitter irony in the fact that when the planes hit, the state's leaders in law enforcement and civil liberties were gathered in Atlantic City to say they were united in the fight to condemn and end racial profiling. Then, of course, everything changed.
Regrettably, much of the information that we're hearing is not good. One of the trade centers looks like it may have been totally demolished.
And with that, 1 year ago today, the state's first and only summit on racial profiling came to a stunning halt.
As I was talking to you, my office called to tell me that there was smoke coming out of the Pentagon because of a plane that hit the Pentagon.
But with the bombings, with the tragedy and the terror, came new talk of racial profiling, trampled rights, and new targets.
A lot of Muslims did not feel the pain that they're feeling now when African Americans used to talk about discrimination.
But
now you talk to them, and they will tell you. We know exactly how it feels to be discriminated. We know exactly how it feels to be humiliated.
And while for most of America the concern this year was with personal safety and national security, in communities like this one, there's been an extra source of fear and vulnerability.
I learned in law school that there is a presumption of innocence.
You think that's changed?
That definitely has changed, and I tell you why. For Muslims in America after 9/11, the standard seems to be, you're presumed to be guilty until you prove innocence.
Sir, I'm 4 months for immigration in a jail here.
At a governmental level, I fear that it's getting worse because day in, day out, almost every other day, you find out that another person's being detained without charge.
Your problem is with INS.
I need like 15 minutes because I put in a jelly here. No anybody listen to me.
Our country was attacked, and I was feeling the same thing what any American family felt. Yet, I had to go one step further to say that I'm innocent of this, or my community is innocent of this. You know, it's like, you know, I'm victim twice. One is a victim as an American, and one as a Muslim.
It's an argument that may not resonate in the wider culture, where some profiling may seem unpreventable.
It's probably a safe bet that in the cornfields of Iowa, cells from Al-Qaeda weren't being fermented.
Where an extraordinary threat may be seen to justify extraordinary measures.
Well, they better do something quick. I think there's a fine line. And I don't think the federal government nor the County of Passaic in this instance has crossed that line. These are extreme times. I don't think these are extreme measures.
Measures like mass interviews of Muslims.
There are cases where, very legitimately, they have information that should be followed up. But it has gone overboard, and in situations, individuals have been treated not as individual citizens, like the Constitution requires.
Like immigration hearings ordered behind a blanket of silence, like the secrecy the federal government's fought for in detaining hundreds, even thousands, of Middle Eastern or Muslim immigrants.
We've seen a change in immigration court proceedings and immigration detention practices carried out by the government.
Civil liberties advocates point most recently to the holding of U.S. citizens as enemy combatants, barred from access to U.S. courts.
Obviously, safety is a big concern to everyone, and it should be extremely high priority. It should be a top priority, but it doesn't mean going against our basic nature.
In fact, the official secrecy surrounding the detentions has given rise to more than 10 months of litigation. And though the ACLU has won several battles in court, so far it has lost the war to have names and numbers and charges made public.
I would like to hear, because I haven't, a real good argument for what public interest is served by releasing these names.
As Passaic County Counsel, Bill Pasquarell III has been involved in the litigation, defending the secrecy at his county's jail, where the greatest number of detainees were held, most of them now deported. But is it just illegals who have found themselves under scrutiny?
They're going to green card holders now, they're going to U.S. passport holders, U.S. naturalized citizens, and saying, what were the circumstances of you procuring your green card or your citizenship?
And though Ali was born in this country, he too came under suspicion just 9 days after the attacks in a late-night interrogation by the FBI.
One gentleman asked me how many times a day I prayed. Another gentleman asked me, do I frequent the mosque?
Ali first told us his story last year, but last week he had a new story to tell, prompted again by the kind of tip the Attorney General has been encouraging. Again, he says, from a worker on a job site.
He said I made comments that were anti-American again. And
not true.
Not true at all, absolutely. I never even had a discussion with this fellow. I didn't even know what he looked like.
But the inquiries this time came from state police, and in a decidedly different tone.
Me being a partner in what was going on instead of being a criminal, or instead of me actually feeling like a victim. I didn't feel like a victim at this point.
But Ali says that does not reflect what's happening in the rest of his community.
Unfortunately, the immigrants are still very terrified. And again, the arrests haven't stopped. If anybody thinks that these INS detentions have come to an end, over the past 3 days, 60 more have been arrested.
The ACLU has filed a number of lawsuits now for people who were either Arabic or perceived to be, who were thrown off of airplanes, essentially for no reason other than they were dark-skinned men on an airplane.
It's coming from the top being the Department of Justice. What does it tell me? It tells me this is nothing but a nationally sanctioned profiling.
A profiling that hasn't drawn the same kind of fire.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it?
As the targeting of blacks on New Jersey's highways did, on the very day that the planes hit.
This illegal and immoral practice must end. We can't erase racial profiling overnight, but we will eradicate it over time.
Before there were new targets, new tactics, and new defense of a new brand of profiling.
We're saddened that our brothers and sisters have been in many instances targeted inappropriately. But I do think there are certain instances that are reasonable and acceptable in terms of allowing our federal government and our county law enforcement agencies to ensure that the tragedy of September 11th doesn't happen again, and that we ultimately find out who was supporting these efforts to take down our government.
And so, in the name of safety, there are new definitions and new defense of some kinds of profiling: racial, religious, ethnic, from who gets questioned, stopped, or scrutinized, to who gets taken off of planes. And that's just the start of what's been changing in the last 12 months in official policy and practice.
In fact, the controversy continues over equal protection and much more. Are some basic protections on the line? Will we pay a high price for changing the rules on everything from secrecy to surveillance to profiling, all in the name of national security? Or are these the kind of questions that we simply can't afford in a time of national crisis? Some answers from some experts when we come back, so stay with us.
I think a few people have been denied their civil liberties, but on the whole, it's going to make it safer for the rest of us. Then it should be safer for all of us.
Americans are angry, and they're taking it out on, Arabs and Muslims, because what they did to our country.
Sometimes you think that, maybe we shouldn't allow any more people in the country, or, take better precautions, better measures of screening certain people before they come in.
They attacked our way of life. So that means they totally disagree with American lifestyle and everything.
Just to make a quick analogy, if you accidentally slammed your fingers in a car door, you would look at every single car door differently from that point on. So I just think it's a natural, normal reaction.
Is the war on terror threatening not just our enemies, but our own civil rights? There is no one answer, as we're about to hear from three of those in a position to know. Jan Ting is a former Assistant Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and a current professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. Frank Askin teaches constitutional law at Rutgers Law School, Newark, and he's also general counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union. And with us from Newark, Andrew McCarthy, a veteran federal prosecutor from New York City who successfully tried the terrorism case against the so-called blind sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman. He wants you to know that the opinions he expresses here are his own and not the government's, and Frank Askin wants you to know that his opinions are his own and not those of the ACLU. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me start by bringing back to mind something that the viewers saw just a few seconds ago, which is a quote from Michael Chertoff. He's from New Jersey. He's been on this show, but more importantly, he's the #2 man at the Justice Department and really in charge of many of the initiatives that we're going to talk about. And he indicates that we, meaning the government, are not barbarians. Obviously responding to some of what he's heard by way of criticism. By the way, he's talking to the ABA, a bunch of lawyers. Let me ask you, Jan, whether there is something in this debate that at least raises questions about whether or not some actions that a government can take in the name of security might threaten the kind of civilization that is attempting to be built here in America.
Well, I think we are dealing with barbarians, but the barbarians are the terrorists who mean America harm. Some people think nothing has changed. I think since 9/11 we've been engaged in a life and death struggle with international terrorism, and I think that does change our perspective. And it does mean that we have to take seriously this struggle, and we can't go on living by the rules that we were living under before 9/11.
Frank, I think few people would disagree that those who attack civilians in the way that happened in September are acting in a barbaric way. The question is whether on the other side there is some concern about...
Maybe it's the barbarians versus the despots. I believe the Ashcroft Justice Department has been behaving in a tyrannical and despotic fashion. I think they have turned the basic American notion that we are a government of laws on its head. And they're saying, forget about the laws, don't worry about the laws, we'll protect you. So it's no longer a government of laws, it's a government of we, the president and the executive branch and the attorney general, will look after you and don't worry about the laws
To the
anymore.
contrary, I think there is legal precedent for everything that the government has done to this point. My only concern...
Unfortunately, that may be true that there may be legal precedent, but it's bad precedent, whatever they're citing.
We're going to get to specifics. Let me give Andrew an opportunity to address the fundamental question of whether there have been some charges that raise the legitimate concern that our response to barbarity has also sometimes raised questions about whether we're really supporting civilized conduct.
Well, I think that what one needs to keep in mind is that we are actually in a state of war. The precedents that I would be concerned about are not so much legal precedents as the precedent and the tradition of which arm of government propels the nation during a time of war. To the extent that there have been aggressive acts that are attributable to the government, they are in essence in the compartment of activity that is aimed at combating a war that we're actually in. And I think the fact that we've had a criminal justice response, particularly since the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, to domestic acts of terrorism, to some international acts of terrorism, sometimes confuses people into thinking that the criminal justice response is the only response. Primarily, in terms of national security, terrorism is a military problem, not a criminal justice problem.
Well, does that mean that you think that to the extent that people raise either questions about constitutional protections or questions about whether, even in the context of humanitarian law, all of the kinds of requirements of, for example, the Geneva Convention are being followed, are inappropriately raising those issues because of the nature of the war?
Well, I think we need to be clear on exactly what we're talking about. The constitutional protections that we're speaking about, due process, attorney-client privilege, Fourth Amendment, those are primarily designed to accord protections to people who are vested with those protections in terms of criminal proceedings. They are not easily transposed into the ambit of a war, which is what we're in now. And to the extent that there have been particular detentions that have raised ire in the press, raised ire among activist groups, it's often been a case of trying to transpose criminal justice principles, which are meant to protect people who are involved in criminal justice proceedings, when in fact they're actually ensnared in the net because they've been involved in acts
Andrew,
of
hold
war.
on. It claims you're comfortable. Frank, you wanted to
The
respond.
last time I read the Constitution, it said only Congress could declare war, and to my knowledge, Congress has not declared war.
All right, I plan to start with profiling. Let me bring up a specific instance.
So you'd say there was no Vietnam
Andrew,
War?
hold on a second. Let me bring up a specific that I think may crystallize this a little bit. A man named Jose Padilla, born in the Bronx, was arrested in the United States. Is currently being held not by the Justice Department, but by the Defense Department, without charge, without access to counsel.
Right.
That seems to put us right on the line which you were addressing.
Well,
let me first turn to Frank and say, Frank, does that raise any issues of constitutional concern?
Absolutely. This is an American citizen being detained. I mean, it's like something out of Kafka or out of China, maybe. When they do things to people, to citizens in China like this, we scream. This is a man who's entitled to due process. Even non-citizens in this country are entitled to due process. They are persons under the 14th Amendment. This person is actually an American citizen. I mean, he's entitled to every possible constitutional protection. The president can't just say, I'm stripping you of your rights. That's not the president's authority.
Due process is...
Let me do Jan, then we'll come to you, Andrew.
There's ample legal precedent for what the government is doing. During World War II, thousands of prisoners of war were brought to the United States, Germans and Italians. One of them actually turned out to be an American citizen. And he was able to get a lawyer to go into court and say, hey, how about a writ of habeas corpus? I'd like to go out and see a movie. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held, along with the district court, that the fact that you happen to be a United States citizen makes no difference. And the determination of whether you're a combatant is a determination that's made not by the courts, but made by the military. And if the military determines that you're a combatant, you are detained for the duration under the rules of war.
But a couple things have changed. The first is this is a war unlike any other with no foreseeable end. But Andrew, what do you think about the fact that we've certainly had the Geneva Conventions since some of the cases on which we rely, and at least there's some people concerned about Padilla, a citizen, not even a naturalized citizen, being held without any kind of process at all?
You know, look, I think what Frank said about due process is true. We owe due process to everyone, but due process is what process is due under the circumstances.
What's due, Padilla, in your view?
When someone is an enemy combatant, when someone has taken up arms against the United States, the executive branch is not only empowered, it's virtually mandated to do what is necessary in connection with national security. That doesn't mean, someone mentioned that Jose Padilla is from the Bronx. I'm from the Bronx too. I don't think there's a great contingent of folks from the Bronx who are worried that George Bush is going to lock us up any moment on a whim.
Is that the test? How many people are worried?
I don't think so. I mean, who decides who's an enemy combatant? Does George Bush decide? Does the court of law decide? That's the first issue. They're doing away with judicial review. It's the major problem here.
A country
the military does not decide the rights of American citizens. That's not the history of this country.
And the United States
I don't care what the Ninth Circuit says.
In this case, has the military decided?
Right.
The military hasn't decided.
The military has decided. The military has decided on Padilla. The military has decided on Hamdi. The reason we detain enemy combatants is to prevent them from committing further belligerent acts against the United States. We don't bring criminal charges against them, although we can. But if we choose not to, we simply detain them as enemy combatants. The term enemy combatant was not invented by the Bush administration. The term enemy combatant is reflected in the Geneva Conventions. These are people who are irregulars, they're not wearing uniforms, they're not part of disciplined military organizations, and they're not fighting on behalf of recognized governments.
The Geneva Convention does not overrule our due process
Let me
clause.
move past the Geneva Convention because the level of the debate suggests there are at least some issues here, though whether they raise the issue of barbarity or not isn't clear. The irony of our current situation, Janting, is that there were conferences on profiling taking place in New Jersey, which had been a lead and symbolically important state in the debate over profiling, which were really about maybe finally feeling we had put profiling aside as a law enforcement tool because it doesn't work and it raised a host of social policy questions. Obviously, the issue was resurrected by September 12th.
Yes, but I think there's a very big difference between the kind of profiling that was conducted by the New Jersey State Police, which was based on appearance and skin color, and the kind of profiling that's been conducted by the Department of Justice in, for example, the initiative to question young Arab men who have come to the United States since January 1st, 2000, in the initiative to prioritize the removal...
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that there are Muslims on the streets of, say, Patterson, who would say to them it seems quite similar to what was happening to blacks on the turnpike?
I think we need to emphasize, we're not talking about Muslim Americans. We're talking about visitors to the United States who entered since January 1st, 2000, and we're talking about absconders, foreigners who were captured by the INS,
but
brought
we did a program about a New Jersey
judges.
American of Turkish descent who was
I'm
subject to
saying
the same treatment.
what the government is doing is not judging people like the New Jersey State Police did. The state police, as I understand it, were judging people on the basis of skin color and appearance. And the determination of the Department of Justice is to adjudicate people based on gender, on basis of age, on basis of country of origin, as determined by objective documents that they presented when they entered the United States. Those are objective documents, not skin color, not appearance.
Is there any similarity, or does it raise any concerns?
Oh, I think there's similarities. You know, the worst case of profiling in American history was the internment of 120,000 Japanese during World War II. And the Supreme Court, by the way, upheld that. We have precedent to uphold rounding up people because of their ethnicity, because of some perceived threat to national security. Fortunately, it took 40 years, but finally the United States apologized to the Japanese and actually offered reparations. Congress passed a bill authorizing reparations to those 120,000 Japanese Americans.
Seems to be saying that it's different. Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
There's nothing close to the Japanese internment occurring now. And again, the principles that apply in a state of war are different than those that apply in a criminal court. What we're talking about here are the World Trade Center bombing, Somalia, Khobar Towers, the coal, the World Trade Center bombing, over 3,000 innocent people slaughtered in a state of war, and to compare that to what law enforcement looks at in terms of whose ethnicity is racing down the New Jersey Turnpike is frivolous.
I'd just like to add that what's wrong with the Japanese internment was the internment of hundreds and thousands of American citizens.
There's obviously a lot more to say, so we're not going to stop here. We're going to ask our guests, Frank Askin and Professor Jan Ting and Federal Prosecutor Andrew McCarthy, to stay with us for another half hour. We'll bring it to you next week on Due Process. Till then, for all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
I think the whole Homeland Security thing, it seems on paper to be a good idea.
People are still scared about everybody, you know, in the city or different places, especially in the airports.
Like, you go to a bank and you see Arabs, you know, you get scared. You don't know what, you know, do they have a bomb in their shoe or what's going to happen next?
Certain things have to give to be effective in fighting the terrorists. So I don't see it as a problem.
There's a limit to how far you have to go to effectively protect us. On the other hand, there's no question the government's got to take steps.
We do have to fight for our rights. We do have to fight for, you know, our freedom.
Yeah, I understand how people want to tighten up, but it concerns me a lot. I think someone should be pushing for at least a more open view of what's going on.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,